Thank you for joining us as we recognize Black History Month. To enjoy more library programming like this for you and your family, subscribe to DC Public Library on YouTube, download the DCPL app, and follow us at DCPL on Facebook and Twitter. Take care.
Good evening. I'm Emil Wolbekin, founder of Native Son. I'm thrilled to partner with DC's Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library in this conversation celebrating Black History Month. This February, DC Public Library celebrates the culture and accomplishments of African American communities through the viewpoint of the Black family. The definition of family, like Black life and culture itself, is multifaceted. The family we make, build, or choose provides comfort, encouragement, and inspiration for African Americans to thrive no matter the obstacles. Tonight, I'm happy to introduce Darnell L. Moore, George M. Johnson, and Robert Jones Jr. Good evening, everyone, and I want to thank you, Darnell L. Moore, and George M. Johnson and Robert Jones Jr. for being in conversation tonight about one of my most favorite historical figures, most prominent heroes in social justice, in literature, and in existence, James Baldwin. Notes of a Native Son is a collection of 10 essays that James Baldwin published in 1955. So 65 years ago. And it's tackling issues of race in America and Europe. The volume was his first collection of nonfiction work. And I thought it was very important to speak to the three of you because his voice and his resonance really shows up in your writing, in Darnell's No Ashes in the Fire, in George M. Johnson's All Boys Aren't Blue, and Robert Jones Jr.'s The Prophets. So I guess I want to start with one of my favorite quotes, which is, "I want to be an honest man and a good writer." I mean, that to me just speaks volumes. But what is it about James Baldwin's work? I'm going to start with his writing. What is it about his writing that resonated with you? And I'm going to start with you, Darnell.
Sure. Well, first, I'm really honored to be part of this conversation and smiling, looking at Robert and looking at George and looking at you, Emil, because certainly you all represent the best of what it means to show up in the world, writing into being Black lives, Black, queer, gay lives. I think that quote is really exceptionally Baldwin because one of the things that always drew me towards Baldwin's words, his writing, was his honesty. Here's a person who just does not lie on the page. And it was interesting. I would read Baldwin's criticism and was always so stunned by how regardless of if he was critiquing the work of a friend or critiquing the work of another Black cultural worker, he did so with honesty, with unflinching honesty. And I often say, to love is to not lie. And that is at the heart of Baldwin's work that I've always been impressed with. He writes bare, unafraid. And I think that's what's drawn me to him.
What about you? What about Baldwin's work resonates with you?
Yeah. First of all, I'm happy to be here as well. I think this is amazing. And I think what resonates with me, like to echo Darnell's sentiment, is much of the same. But what I love, I think most about Baldwin is that there are times you read it and you're just like, what? Like, what are you trying to say? Like, I can't follow it, or it's like, I don't agree with it necessarily, or it's like, it like triggers something. But I love that because there are moments where I'm writing and I reread something that I've written and I'm like, wait, what the hell am I trying to say? Or like I've written it and it's in the current book and I hear someone else say it out loud and I'm like, I could not have written that. Like I did not write it. But I think the thing that I took was that I wrote it, but it may have been the truth, right? Like I wrote what I was feeling in that moment with what I had and what I knew at the time. And so I think what I take from Baldwin is like this unapologetic nature of writing, right, wrong, or indifferent, but being willing to have the conversation about it at the end of the day, right? Like we got to watch the powerful moments of Baldwin's words and what they meant to us, but we also got to watch powerful moments of when the other powerful writers had to challenge Baldwin on some of the things he said. And I think that actually is like my favorite part about it, was because he was always so willing to listen and to learn and to let it influence his next works and the next things that he said out of his mouth. And so I think that's the one thing that I always try to carry with me, is that one, my writing is not perfect. And to never walk around like my writing cannot be challenged, like I cannot be challenged, like I cannot be critiqued. The fact that Baldwin, you know, his writing, he was using writing as a tool of liberation and using writing as a tool of social justice. So as people who are also writing and using it as a tool of social justice, we also have to remember how powerful our words can be when they are right, but also how powerful our words may be when they may be a little bit incorrect, and be willing to take it in because the next set of words that we write need to correct whatever it is that we did prior. And I think that's what I like to take away from Baldwin's writing, is that, like Darnell said, it's very truthful, so truthful at times that it makes you challenge yourself, and it makes you just challenge everything that you may have thought you knew.
Thank you for that. Robert, what about you? What is it about Baldwin's writing that resonated with you?
He once said, James Baldwin, that when you write these sentences, they must be as clean as a bone. And when he said that, I was like, what does that mean? What does it mean to write as clean as a bone? And what I did was I started to inspect his writing. And what I think he means is that you strip away all the excess until you get to the essential truth that cannot be denied. And whenever I read his work, I get chills, because there's always an essential truth that cannot be denied. Like I'll be reading a few sentences and I'll be like, oh, I could quarrel with him on that. And then I'll get to that one line and I'm like, oh, he just read me for filth. Baldwin really zeroed in on what it meant to be honest. Like Darnell said, I liked what Darnell said about to be honest is to be loving. You cannot live in lies and also hold love. They're incompatible. And Baldwin knew this, and so he refined his art to almost as close as we can understand perfection, where he got down in the dirt and said, listen, I'm saying this to you, white people or whomever, because I love you, but I'm about to let you have it. You are not living up to what it means to be a human being, to be humane. And so you have to know, and I'm going to hold up this mirror, and my words are going to be the mirror. That's how clear they're going to be. And that was just something that I always admired in him. He was fearless. He's this slight man holding up a cigarette, speaking with the mid-Atlantic accent, in their talk, letting them know and writing it down so that those of us who come after will know how to do it. And like George said, by no means was he above reproach, as we saw Nikki Giovanni and Audre Lorde take him to task. But then I think about his last work, Evidence of Things Not Seen, where you see Audre Lorde's influence and Nikki Giovanni's influence, where he can admit to himself, oh, I got this wrong the whole time. Let me tell you about what I learned from Black women. So as George said, we go from writing as an exquisite art, but nothing that makes us beyond reproach, so that we can be an even better writer than that.
How do you all, because I struggle with this, how do you balance, because they're very different, his fiction writing with his essay writing.
Hmm.
And which part are you drawn to most? And I'll go back. We'll go in the same order. Darnell, what do you know? Which piece speaks to you more?
Oh, that's a really good question. While he is sort of dabbling with different genres, and we also know he was dabbling in poetry. I mean, he was moving across genre. He was genre bending. I love what Robert said. Like, at the heart of a work, while we tend to think of Baldwin as something of an evangelist, like a person who's proselytizing a social justice message, I want to be clear that he is, I love this, Robert, an exquisite artist.
Yes.
That he can turn a sentence, whether that is in nonfiction and prose, epistolary form, poetry, or fiction, is a testament to the fact that here is somebody that was really keen on understanding how to use the written word to get at the interior life of the characters that he brought to the page. That is a gift. And that is, I think, was at the heart, regardless of if the genre switches. Baldwin is so keen at unpacking interiority, whether that is Giovanni, who was a person very much unlike himself in Giovanni's room, placed in another part of the ethos of the world, or his nephew's life world, or his father's life world, or any of his characters. The similarity is that he is striking at the heart of interiority in all of those different projects. So that's what's always compelled me. Now, what I've been drawn to, Giovanni's Room was one of the first books that I read that focused on a sort of non-heteronormative life world. You know, I was kind of mad at Baldwin because I was like, I want a book about Hakeem and Abdul uptown. All right, why the hell I gotta be? You know what I'm saying? Like, I wanted to sort of that.
Yeah.
So I got to turn to like Essex Hemphill and some other folk to get that life world.
That's
so
right.
While I had my own angst about his what I saw as not an inability, but the lack of access to a Baldwin that was really writing about my life. I just love that here was a person that could, but like, do you know how hard it is? And I'm thinking about you both who are working on fiction works, how hard it is to put on the page the life world of somebody who's different than yourself. That itself is an artistic form of expression that is quite exquisite. I've been drawn to his nonfiction works, and even more now to the sort of works that have been unpublished or the works that have been overly celebrated, to the poetic works, because at the heart of all his works is that sort of drive to strike at the heart of what it means to be human under the conditions of white supremacy. Right. Under the conditions of heteronormativity, within a particular times in which he was writing.
Amen and Ashe. With that, George.
Right. How do you follow? I don't know how to follow either one of them. No, honestly, I'm very big on nonfiction. That is like my wheelhouse. That is like the love of my life. And I think, so that's what I'm attracted to most when I think about Baldwin, but I think I'm attracted to nonfiction because, history, the history we've been taught is all fiction. American history is fiction. Black history is fiction because it's taught by white people, primarily in school systems, right? So everything that we've been indoctrined with as nonfiction, as real as history, is actually pretty fiction, right? And so Baldwin's work gives you the real, right? Like, it really gives you actual real. And I think that's one of those things for me that I'm heavily focused on in my work. And, why I choose to write a lot of nonfiction is because like I said, the quote unquote history and truths that currently exist are not real, and they've never been real. Mm-hmm. And we as Black writers rarely had the opportunity to tell those real stories. And even when we were able to tell them, oftentimes if you had a white publisher, they pushed back, or they made you manipulate, or they made you change. And so I'm always heavily drawn to everything James Baldwin talked about in like that truth in totality, because it's just such a rare space that we get to occupy. We don't actually get to tell our stories from us in that way. And, I think about like, and you know, I often think about slavery, which is something I'm going to take on, something I'm actually working on as well, because I think about how, like, when we think about the slave narratives, right, and the Workmen's Progress Administration, and there are 6,000 slave narrative, millions of people were slaves. We have only 6,000 accounts from actual slaves, and there were millions of them. So when you even just think about the fact that we only have that is all we have of the truth of slavery, right? And so even, you know, that makes me think about the Baldwins, the Lores, the Giovanni, you know, the fact that they get to give us truth, that slither of it in the midst of the millions of Black folk who have lived these experiences. We only have these nonfiction works to give us that we can hold and say, this was our actual story. And so I lean heavily into his words and his truth on the nonfiction.
And Robert, I'm so curious to hear your response, because you lean into both. So.
You know, this is probably one of the toughest questions. And had you asked me 5 years ago, I would have been very clear that it was his nonfiction. But today, it is his fiction that I'm drawn to most. And in particular, because Darnell brought up a really good point, the disappointing thing as a Black person at the intersection of queerness reading something like Giovanni's Room is that you wished he had gone there and gave us the Black queerness. And you're reading this and you're saying, but why? Why did you go to France? And I think he said in an interview that he thought it would have been too much at the time for people to take. So he did it with whiteness. But there is a work in which Baldwin does wrestle with Blackness and queerness. And I'm talking about early on in Go Tell It on the Mountain, which is one of my favorite works of fiction of all time. It's semi-autobiographical. Baldwin's talking about his him being raised in the church. He goes back a little bit in time to give you some of his family history in their migration north. But there's a scene where he is in the church and he's wrestling with another sort of altar boy or, you know, junior pastor or what have you. And there's this moment of tension between them. And you know what they're both feeling, but what the church won't allow them to explore. And I thought, that is what it feels like to be locked in the closet, or to be denied your essential intrinsic humanity as a Black queer person. And he captured it with such beauty and such pain. And I said, okay, he gave me this, so maybe I can forgive him Giovanni's Room. And then later on, he does explore Black queer relationships, like in Just Above My Head and such. But while he is probably better known for his nonfiction, The Fire Next Time in particular, because it is so incisive, there is great beauty in Baldwin's fiction. And I think we need to return to it, because there's a scene in Go Tell It on the Mountain where he's describing catching the Holy Ghost. Have mercy. I have never seen it described in this way. And the language is so complicated, but it's also so beautiful. And you almost feel like you're catching the Holy Ghost. You know, it's just remarkable. So I would have to say it is his fiction now that draws me to him.
Okay. It's funny because I remember when I was young, like in high school, reading Baldwin, I would have to go back. Like I'd be like, I got to read that. Like I couldn't just read the book. Like I'd have to like, wait, what did he say? Let me go back. But what's very interesting about his work is the cultural resonance that it has today. And so I want to split this up, because I think part of it is last year when we went through the racial reckoning and the protest, it's like everybody was quoting Baldwin. Every Baldwin quote, every video clip was coming up. It's interesting to me that when I'm Not Your Negro came out, right after Trump was elected, that movie to me spoke exactly where we were in America And then we went through these 4 years of terror. Why does Baldwin's words and ideology from that time transcend to where we are now?
Is this up for anybody? Oh, I mean, I think short answer is because it wasn't. It's not just 4 years of terror. The terror was there when Baldwin was here, and the terror is still here now. So the terror never left, and so the words could always fit the current times because the terror never left. The terror may have changed the way it looked. It may have changed the way it operated, and it may have changed the systems that it operated within, and it may have shut certain systems down just to birth out other oppressive systems, but the terror never left. And so the words will always fit the current time period that Black people are in, because the entire world as a unit still operates on anti-Blackness. And so as long as the world as a unit has to continue to operate on that as the top system, which is anti-Blackness, the words from those who experienced it firsthand and were able to call it out firsthand will always transcend through time, right? And I think that's why many of our great writers and thinkers, when we can go back to their words and they fit, fit perfectly in current situations, is because those situations never left, right? The Susan B. Anthonys of the world are still here. Hillary, I always go back to that moment of them running to her grave and putting stickers, I voted stickers on her grave. And I just always kept thinking and these are the people who sit next to Black women, just like Susan B. Anthony did, and didn't want them to have voting rights and didn't want them to have. And so again, the history never changes because their heroes are our terrorists. And so, when I'm watching the Senate, quote Abe Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson raped Sally Hemings, right? Their heroes are our terrorists. And so the words of our ancestors who dealt with those same terrorists will always be the guiding light for us to get through those times. And so that's the long answer, is because the terrorists and the terrorism of whiteness never has changed. It's always lived, even if it lived in different forms. The words that they said then will always carry us through till now.
I'm also thinking about, I think it's important to sort of demystify this idea that Baldwin was always beloved. So in many ways, Baldwin was writing way ahead of his time. And that's really, really important, right? I mean, you have folk like Aldrich Cleaver who critique Baldwin's words in Soul on Ice. Leroy Jones and Mary Baraka, who had some homophobic to say about Baldwin, who would then, as he's sort of writing a eulogy of sorts about Baldwin's life, is owning up to the fact that Baldwin is actually a stunning leader. And he was really in a moment where the race man, quote unquote, literally was understood, the arbiter of Blackness, the persons who were to be able to stand up, if you can stand, in front of the public square and talk on behalf of Black people, was imagined as Black, cisgender, heterosexual folk. And here he was attempting to sort of move into this race man trope that was reserved for the folk who were understood by, in the larger public discourse, as the true leaders of the Black conversation. But I just want to be clear. Baldwin wasn't just he wasn't uber popular with everybody in that moment. And I think it's important to name that, because it's easy for us to walk away with the perception that we had folk loving the hell out of him in that moment. And that wasn't true.
Right.
It wasn't true. So we're only living in a recuperation of Baldwin's legacy in this moment.
That's right.
And that is so important, that it took his voice to sort of be, and let's be clear, he was in the room. He was in those conversations too. I'm not saying that he was absent from them, but I'm also certain, based on what other folk had to say about him, that just because you're in a room don't mean that all the Black folk in the room with you are talking with you like that. And so here we are living into a type of politic that was very ahead of its time in many ways. because it's precisely coming from a Black person who was giving us a Black radical politic who ain't straight. So we're just now catching up, I think, to the Baldwin that was.
One of the things that you learn as an artist, particularly as a writer, is that you will know no one better on this planet than the people that despise you. And Baldwin knew who despised him and knew them better than they knew themselves. Baldwin's analysis of whiteness is foundational. He knew, and this is another thing he knew about whiteness, that it would never change, because it was in a state of infancy or adolescence perpetually. That what it did in 1765, it was going to do in 1865, it was going to do in 1965, it's going to do in 2065, because part of whiteness is imagined innocence for every crime, and an absolute refusal to engage with the confront what it has done. It is called for unity without reconciliation, unity without restoration, unity without reckoning. That is what whiteness does. It says, yes, that thing happened, but let us move forward without having dealt with the mess that it left. Baldwin knew that. So if you know that, and you're writing from your understanding of that, no matter when you're writing it, if you're writing it when Wallace Thurman was writing or Frederick Douglass was writing, it's going to remain true now when Darnell, George, and myself are writing, because whiteness is static, it is unimaginative, and it is utterly infantile, and it's predictable. And so we often say, Baldwin was a prophet. No, he just knew people really, really well. And he knew that fundamentally, most people don't change, and certainly not these oppressive systems.
I love that. When you all are writing, is Baldwin top of mind, or is it just your Black queer experience?
That's such a good question.
That is.
That's such a good question. I mean, I will say in short, and going back to what Robert, you said earlier, I want to underscore that Baldwin is he is an artist, an exquisite one. I was always fascinated with his use of that comma in his sentences. I'm like, you could write the sentence the size of a paragraph, and that thing is grammatically correct. I mean, it is like
flawless.
You are you better rock the comma, okay? So I just want to be clear, so I do think about Baldwin is the type of writer I would go to when I want to be reminded about the need to bring beauty to our words, even when those words are hinting at or unpacking the harsh realities that exist because of structural oppression. He could write about the very presence of the dehumanizing impact of something like white supremacy in the most beautiful way, in the most powerful way. And I'm just stunned by that. So Baldwin comes to mind when I think about sentence structure, when I think about the ability to pull together words, to weave words in such a way that they can have a person feel into the thing that I'm trying to get across. And I wish I had the ounce of the talent that he has with sentence construction. But I will say, I think it's often the case when most people talk to, when I'm in conversation, they're like, I know Baldwin has to be the person that you go to. And I'm like, no, actually for me, it was the folk who were writing at the sort of epicenter of the AIDS epidemic, like Essex Hemphill and Joseph Beam, other countries. Those were the writers, the Black, gay, bi, same gender loving, queer, non-binary writers that really weren't impactful to me because they took the artistry that I think is present in Baldwin's words and forwarded into this sort of way of talking about the multiple textures. I mean, the real authentic textures of Black queer life in ways I just never saw before. So I sort of marry the sort of elements that were present in like Baldwin's writing with the words of folk like the Essex Hemphill and the Joseph Beams and some others, along with Audre Lorde and June Jordan too.
I think that I, in some ways, particularly when I'm writing nonfiction, some of the moral authority, some of the certain Baptist cadences, Pentecostal cadences, I think if I see that present in my work, I know that's Baldwin's influence. And I would say that in some ways it's Baldwin sitting on one shoulder and Morrison sitting on another.
Yes.
When I'm writing, because what I'm always thinking is, would this be good enough to withstand the scrutiny of a Baldwin or a Morrison? And I don't always accomplish that because I could not touch the hem of either of their garments. But that is what I'm striving for, because to me, that is the top of your game. That is when you have transcended, when you have moved from writer to artiste, and when you are now somewhere up in the ether, having conversations with the ancestors and the spirits, and they are giving you something to bring back down for the people. So I'm always trying to achieve that. And for me, the people who do that are the Morrisons and the Baldwins. So yes, I do attempt to consciously reach that level of achievement. I don't know if I make it.
You do.
You do.
You do. Let me just be clear.
But I try. I absolutely try, and it's definitely conscious.
What about you, George?
Oh man, it's tough because like the works that I was reading are like Darnell's, and like
Talk about it.
no shade, like you know what I mean. It just is what it is. Like I'm sitting here on this with a person whose work I read heavily, and still read all the time. You know what I mean? And so it's like I always love anytime Darnell like pens an essay. Because he doesn't do it as often anymore. So it's like when we do get an essay from Darnell, I'm always like, here we go. Like it's about to be one of them rides. But I learned so much from just my peers in a lot of ways. Like I do love reading the works of Morrison and Baldwin and going through like just a lot of and I'm very big on like reading about people's lives and you know, like not just necessarily their writing, but like what their experiences were and everything outside of the writing and all of that. But my peers, like, oh my God, my peers keep me so grounded. People like Robert, people like Darnell, younger writers like Deshaun Harrison, Hari, Ziad. I mean, like my peers just like, I'm always like blown away because it like challenges me like to go to places that I know are there, but I'm always afraid to like reach and touch that I know are in me, but like just untapped. I lean heavily on Baldwin, Morrison. It's probably going to sound silly, but like I lean heavily on like quotes. Like I'm a quote person, and I know that's like kind of like easy, like, oh, but like those are the quotes, right? And it's like, yeah, but the way that I process it is a little bit different. And so like even with the next book, every chapter starts off with a quote from my grandmother. Mm-hmm. And that idea came from Baldwin and Morrison because I kept sitting with myself and I was like, we know we can always go to those people to quote like macro level as Black folk. We're gonna always go to Lord and we go to G. Like when something happens, we like let me go pull a quote from Maya Angelou. Like let me. So I'm always like that's what we do. Like I'm sure like if we get on, you know, like that's how it always is. Like if a major moment happened, you go see them quotes like flying from our ancestors, right? But what it made me think, like I was just reading like a bunch of Baldwin quotes, a bunch of Morrison quotes, and then it hit me, and I was like, but when in the micro, our quotes are from our grandmothers, and they're from like our mom would say something to us, or our father would say something to us. And like, that's like how we get through life. Really, it's not on like those macro level quotes. It's really on the micro level quotes that come from people who will never get to write books, people who the world will never get to know their full story, people who will never be quoted, you know, when major things happen, right? And so that's what drove me to using the quote technique to begin each chapter of my next book, of like these lessons that I learned from this Black matriarch who lived during the same time as Baldwin and faced the same things as Baldwin. Clearly my grandmother was not Black and queer, but she was Black and from the South and raised in a family, you know, and dealt with anti-Blackness and dealt with racism and dealt with many of those same obstacles, you know, and so that's what I often, that's where I knew I was in my pocket with this current book, was when I was just going through all of those quotes and then it hit me like, that really is it, because that's the thing that we carry with us. When my grandmother passed, when I hear her, I hear that quote, okay, you're right. You know what I mean? And so yeah, that's the thing for me.
It's so funny because I am a go-to Baldwin quote person as well. And whenever I'm really digging in, I always get to that quote where he's like, things shouldn't be reduced to just a quote. And I'm always like, oh.
That's why I love it, because the quote opens up the story. So there's a whole story now, right? Because this quote is like you said, it's not reduced to it. It's just like that starting point of the learning and like the everything. And so like, just like we were saying earlier, like, because we've been using quotes the whole time, but then the quote got us to go to the place. And so I love it because the quote becomes the vehicle for many people to learn.
Love that. I'm thinking about an essay that I was able to humbly edit by Darnell, where he talked about Blackness is queerness, right? That is the same. And so why is it that we all go to Baldwin? I mean, he never really came out or invited us in. He's never, you know, speaking to historians who study his work, and these are Black, gay, and queer men. But what is it? Is it, you know, I think of, you were mentioning the other people who have inspired us. I think about Marlon Riggs, talking about Snap Queens. I mean, James Baldwin's the original Snap Queen. Come on. But what is it? Why do we gravitate so closely? I mean, Native Son is named after Notes of a Native Son. What is it? What is that attraction for us?
That's a good question. I mean, a reference that idea, you know, I often say Black was queer before queer was cool. And I'm thinking here about the politics of queerness, not an identity category.
Right.
You know, not me naming myself as sort of non-hetero, like not a non-straight person. I'm thinking about queerness as a politics of destabilization, of ripping apart societal understandings and norms that have been cages for us. Now, here's the thing. Ain't that Blackness? Black people have long, since we're dragged to these shores, have pushed against, reconstituted, redefined everything from notions of family to community and so much else, ways of being, you know, pushing back against a whole bunch of ideas that have been somehow put on top of us and have caged us. So that is sort of queerness before queerness becomes popular within the academic domain and popular discourse. That's what I meant by that. Now, what's interesting then about Baldwin's work is Baldwin is absolutely pushing against norms. And Baldwin is in his writings is actually queering our understanding of race relations. He's queering our understandings of sort of Black manhood and masculinities, even if he himself is finding himself trapped within them, right? He's queering our understandings of family, of place, of love. And I think without him never having to name an identity, what we see are resonances of someone who is actually queering, using queering as a project reimagining, of pushing us to sort of see and imagine something different. And I think that that's what's present, right? Like that is, I think, the gift that is at the heart of his work. The work doesn't necessarily speak to me because he's helping me sort of to give me the words that I need to sort of come into my queerness. When he says something like love is a battle, you know, like when he's writing about his relationship to his father, and in many ways that his father dragged all of these sort of patriarchal understandings into how he understood how he had to be reacting to his son. He is really pushing us to reimagine, to think differently, to do differently. And that's at the heart of his work that I think is actually the queer project, not the gay project.
Right. Right.
The queer project, the project of destabilizing. And I think that that is what it is for me.
And to jump on Darnell's point, what you see in Baldwin's reticence to embrace these structures of like coming out and things of this nature is because they seem to him outside of Blackness. Toward the end of his life, they ask him about the gay movement, and he goes, "You know what? I'm not fond of that movement or that name because there's something inherently racist about those spaces."
Right.
The white queer person the white gay person only wants to be a white straight person. They want all the benefits and privileges of white straight people. They don't give a shit about me. And so Baldwin's queerness, for lack of
you just made me grab my church pearls right there.
Baldwin's queerness is, as Darnell says, it is Blackness. There is no distance between those two things. They're tangled up together. And so when we're looking for things that we see in white queer spaces, the coming out, the naming, the separate identity, Baldwin's like, those things don't service me as a Black person. So I have to reimagine that in some way that is fulfilling and has room for me, because your structures do not have any room for me. I think that's why Black gay men in particular go back to Baldwin almost as the father of the movement, because he was articulating before there was language the kind of thing that Darnell is speaking about, Blackness as queerness, as out and separate and distinct from what we see in these white spaces and such.
Yeah, I don't know how to follow that up, but
maybe I'll grab for the pearls behind my turtleneck.
Right. What about we follow them up with both of those type of statements? But I mean, honestly, I think, you know, as Black writers, Black queer writers, you know, I often say it, like, we had a lot of our heroes stolen, right? Like, even if we were taught about Baldwin, we weren't taught that he was queer. Like, I remember in elementary school them mentioning him. He was a Black man.
At least you got to mention.
Right.
You in elementary school?
Yeah, like, you know, he was a Black, he was a Black man who wrote. And that was as far as it went, right? And so I think, you know, when we talk about, like, why do we go back to him, is because, like Darnell was talking about earlier on, it's like a rediscovery of like you said, like, he was not appreciated then. And so now we are undoing a lot of that and learning for the first time who he was in many ways, especially those who are who identify as Black gay men primarily. But, you know, some of us do already live under the understanding that Blackness is inherently queer and queerness is inherently Black, and the two things cannot be separated. And so when you watch someone who lived their life unapologetically and walked into rooms as that total being in that way, I know many of us lean on that because there is an isolation in public spaces to be us. And, you know, I have to lean back, and what I often do is I think about our ancestors in a way of, like, how did you get through this? How did you move through this? What were you thinking when you wrote this sentence? Like, when you wrote this specific sentence, what were you thinking? How were you feeling? How did you process this? How did you get through this? When did you take the break? When did you step away? When did you step back in? When did you lean in heavy? When did you pull back? You know, and that's what I think I look to him for in a lot of ways, because he is so great with like you said, he's just such a great writer. It just doesn't make sense sometimes how well he writes. And it's art. And so I look at that because it is like the watching of the pull and the give and the sometimes overshare and then the sometimes undershare and the balance between those acts and why it's all important and in the way that he had to do it and did it. And it reminds me of why it's important to give, but to sometimes have to pull or to take away. You can't always be the vessel. Sometimes you got to have other people pour in. And so watching and just learning from that, I think that's why many of us go back to, like you said, the architect of it in many ways for us. So, yeah.
A quick follow-up. Darnell was mentioning earlier how some of our luminaries did not accept Baldwin, Mary Baraka, Eldridge Cleaver, so on. I remember a conversation between Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison, where they said Baldwin confuses his sexuality for his race, which goes back to Darnell's point about Blackness and queerness. So these non-queer Black people were understanding exactly what Baldwin was creating. And they were afraid because then it would force them to look at the inherent queerness in themselves, and they did not want to do that.
Right.
Tell the story.
Thank you for that. So,
Also talking about that critique that, and we should also note that James Baldwin was a stellar cultural critic.
Yes.
Well, I mean, Notes Native Son, when you go through and it's, everything about the Carmen Jones and colorism, and I mean, that he was interrogating that concept then and was so on point and hasn't really changed. Right? But yes, a beautiful cultural critic. With that said, lightning round, as we wrap, what's your favorite Baldwin piece? Fiction, nonfiction, quote?
Mine's is Notes. Yeah.
Mine is Go Tell It on the Mountain.
Mine is Notes.
Notes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I fluctuate between Notes and Giovanni's Room, but I'm with y'all. I was like, but it wasn't. But obviously Notes resonated with me and had a very powerful impact. I read it at least twice a year to remind me of why that particular work inspired the movement, community, and platform called Native Son, and why that resonates now with so many of us Black queer folk. I want to thank you all. Thank you, Darnell Moore. Thank you, George Johnson, and thank you, Robert Jones, for your artistry, your exquisite writing, your authentic voices, and for keeping the legacy of Black queer writers alive.
Thank you, Emil.
Thank you.
Thank you so
All
much.
the same, times 10.
Right.
Yeah.
Pioneer. I told him earlier.
Listen, we are because you are. Don't
Yeah.
get me started.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. On behalf of DC Public Library, thank you, George, Darnell, and Robert, for your time and extraordinary talent. And special thank you to the James Baldwin. You can find their books here at DC Public Library, as well as your local bookstores. Please be sure to follow DC Public Library on social media, download the DCPL app, or subscribe to DC Library content on YouTube for more virtual programming like this. Thank you for joining us.